right, welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Abelard Lindsay, and my name is John Lamberton. I'm the host here, and I wanted to talk to Abelard, who is a computer programmer, a software developer, but also the creator of a number of cognitive enhancement supplements, and they're really interesting formulations. And currently, I think that the conversation on nootropics is at kind of low level, so I wanted to have Abelard on because he's a veteran of the field and wanted to get his take on some stuff. So welcome to the podcast, Abelard.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
So the tradition on this show is to sort of start by just getting a sense of somebody's coffee habits. By day, I'm a coffee professional, and so it helps me round out my model of who somebody is by just knowing what their daily coffee habits are. So do you mind running through some of that?
Yeah, well, in the morning, I take a lot of supplements. Yeah, and as far as coffee goes, I have one of those refillable Keurig things where you take the coffee and you scoop it into the machine with the filter, and you close it all up and you put it in there, and then it goes to the coffee. And that's I just have bulletproof, so I don't know. I figured that's probably the cleanest coffee I'm gonna get. Yeah, and usually it's like 1 or 2 cups in the morning. I try not to have any after about 6, just so I can sleep. That's pretty much how I do it. Sometimes if I'm running around, I'll take some smart caffeine with me, which is like theanine and caffeine. I mean, that's not coffee though.
Right.
Right.
And so you drink it black, or do you drink it with like the MCT bulletproof style, or?
I most of the times I drink it black. Sometimes I add monk fruit extract. That's the best sweetener I've found. I did some research on it, and I couldn't find anything negative about it. I looked around, and it was just it seemed to be all positive. So I decided I'd let myself have some sweetener.
Nice, yeah, and keeping that glycemic impact on the lower side.
Right.
Cool. So I was looking back at these longevity posts, and the earliest one I was able to find is maybe like 2011, but I assume Siltep's been around for longer than that, right?
No, actually, that was about at first I was experimenting with it at home, and I was kind of worried that I was going to get some sort of side effect. I thought it was too good to be true. So I experimented around with it for like a month or two without having anything negative happen. So I decided to post it to Longevity and say, "Hey guys, here's this new idea I came up with. Here's how I think it works. What do you think? Here's what you order from Amazon, and how you can put the stack together and take it." And that's how it all began.
Gotcha. So that early germ of Siltep, I mean, like before, like how long did that take to turn into the actual product?
Oh, well, we released the product in late 2013, and that was precipitated by Tim Ferriss mentioning it on a couple of podcasts, and at a Google Tech Talk, and so then a lot of commercial interest started springing up, and I hooked up with Ben and Roy from Natural Stacks, and we put together a product and a product development agreement and all that stuff, and it was off to the races from there.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And for those that don't know, Siltep is probably Abelard's most notable stack, and it's based around combining artichoke extract and forskolin. And the idea is that it chemically induces long-term potentiation. Is that a fair summation?
Right. Yeah, this is by inhibiting PD4 and raising C-amp levels, it makes the long-term potentiation process whereby Krebs like turns on the transcription machinery in neurons to make them more strongly connect to each other and create long-term memories. That's the idea behind it.
Awesome. Now, in terms of, I mean, like you've made like the Nexus, Mitogen, all these different brain foods. Would you say Siltep is what you're most proud of?
Yeah, I think it's the most original concept. It's something that uh, wasn't, it was very novel. And, I get some criticism sometimes because people say, well, there are no, you know, before you release this on the market, there was nobody who said it, in some academic publication somewhere who said it worked. It's like, well, yeah. And that's why I have a patent on it, because if somebody else invented it, I wouldn't have the patent. So that's, I think that self-experimentation and, um, the way that like the longevity works, where people, they read medical studies and they get ideas and they, pass them around, and there's constructive dialogue. Even people who are skeptics, I welcome that. I think that's a really interesting kind of development in biohacking.
Hmm. I agree, and I think that like the neurochemistry that you're talking about with like camp and luteolin and all this is such a departure from like just kind of like, let's crank up the dopamine, let's crank up the acetylcholine, and the effect that I've gotten from it is very similar to what you've described, that you've experienced, which is kind of this like, I think you described it as a prolonged state of wonderment, and I describe it
Right,
as like
right.
the most scholarly nootropic out there. Can you elaborate on what that prolonged state of wonderment is like?
Yeah, well, I think the experience that most people can relate to is when they go on vacation to some exotic place that they've never been to before, where everything is really different. Then their dopamine cranks up, and dopamine's the natural way that long-term potentiation is happens. And so this by increasing that effect, by prolonging it, it creates that state of wonderment that when you're on vacation, where you remember that vacation really well, while your normal day-to-day grind and going to work, going to lunch, that all just kind of fades away, and it gets ignored. And so by being able to increase and prolong that state of wonder and get into it more easily, it makes learning and making long-term memories easier. And also there's like a feedback loop where uh, the more wonder feeling there is, that kind of builds on itself and sort of um, it increases motivation, because it's like, oh, this is really interesting. And
Hmm.
it's just, that's uh, that's how I would describe it. Now, one thing that's I think is a defect in how, well, it's an oversimplification. It's not a defect. It's an oversimplification. Is how we describe moods. We say I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm delighted, and I like to look at mood as sort of a multidimensional, and cognition as sort of a multidimensional process based on neurotransmitters and
Hmm.
um, so forth, like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, GABA, and early long-term potentiation and late long-term potentiation, and sort of uh, think about things in those terms, really. But when people say, "Oh, it's a smart," going back to the original thing of what is Siltep like, when people say, "Oh, is it what kind of smart drug is it?" I just sort of have to make this more complex elaboration on it, because it's not as simple as it usually is, as these things are described.
Hmm. Cool. Uh, so since it's been around for about 7 years on the market, and you're developing it a little bit before that, can you describe what that era of the sort of cognitive enhancement space looked like compared to now?
Well, back in the early 2000s, when I first got into smart drugs, there were a couple of companies. I don't even know if they're around anymore, but they figured out that you could make synthetic nootropics in China for extremely cheap,
Hmm.
because you could just send these chemical manufacturers in China, like, hey, I want this molecule, and okay, it's not a controlled substance. Okay, fine, we'll make it for you. And that didn't exist before. That was a completely new thing. So you had these bulk paracetam suppliers who would sell you like a kilogram of paracetam for nothing. And then what happened is these guys on a lot of guys on longevity would look up old medical studies from the 70s. I think there was this one called PRL 853, and they would
Mhm.
just call up some guy in China and be like, hey, can you make some for us? And then they would distribute it out. And so that really changed things a lot, because suddenly you had all this old research, and and then you had like the Russian pharmaceuticals like Nupept and phenylparacetam, and they were all sort of coming online. So there was this great era of discovery where there were all these new things that could be made and distributed, and um, it was really interesting. And longevity was sort of the center of that. And there was a lot of great research, and nowadays, people have gotten over the idea that there's no safe way to increase your cognitive capability.
Mhm.
I mean, they used to be like, well, the only thing that can increase cognitive capability is caffeine or stimulants or nicotine, and all this stuff's bad. And now, people are more used to brain supplements and natural ways to increase cognition. So at least people are more understanding of the concepts. And now there's a ton of products out there. There's thousands,
Mhm.
and they all sort of remix the same 20 or so ingredients. You look on the bottle, every bottle you look on it, they're practically the same, plus or minus, 5 different ingredients.
Right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so I think, but it's out there. It's people are used to this now. They're not the idea of nutritional cognitive enhancement. It's not such a bizarre thing that's only associated with like Adderall or various um, stimulants that don't have the greatest reputation deservedly in my humble opinion.
So back then, it sounds like it was kind of like the Wild West with like, importing Chinese molecules and or like Chinese manufactured molecules, and now maybe it's just kind of like more accessible but more diluted. Do you agree with that, or do you feel like
Uh,
we've made any progress?
well, I think that it's I, I think that things are kind of at a stalemate right now.
Hmm.
There was this period of rapid expansion, and things were changing a lot, and then all the backlog of stuff that people were looking at, and I had always wanted to explore sort of petered out, and there were a lot of mixed results, and nothing really, and there were a lot of things that didn't uh, that I'm not a fan of, that didn't go so well. Like, for instance, Phenibut is something I don't recommend anybody take, but was really popular for a while. Uh,
Yeah.
and it just reached sort of a steady state where nothing really new was happening. I mean, people weren't innovating anymore. But I think that people, there's a lot of things that I've gotten out of it, and all the products I've developed are sort of the uh, summation of my research and consolidation of that into these various concepts of natural brain health enhancement.
Hmm. Cool. So I was listening back to an interview where you're talking about, I think it was the Smart Drug Smarts podcast that you did with Roy Krebs, and you're talking about the formation of CILTEP. And you were mentioning these Taiwanese studies that were, talking about these sort of like TCM therapies, like an artichoke leaf was in there. But
Right.
then you're also pulling from more rigorous sort of current scientific sources in terms of like, PubMed. And then there's this, longevity sort of uh, willy-nilly thing that reminds me of like bodybuilding culture, where there's like just kind of reckless stuff, but there's some wisdom in that. How do you balance that, like ancient versus scientific rigorous versus kind of reckless world?
Oh, well, uh, the the way I look at it is you have something like PDE4 inhibition, and then that's studied in one particular context by scientists trying to develop patentable drugs that they can, um, spend 10 years getting through clinical trials. And then I look at, okay, let's look at research being done in natural health. And in China, in Taiwan, they were doing these studies trying to figure out, okay, how do we treat cardio-obstructive pulmonary disease, which is lung inflammation disease caused by smoking that is, they think they can treat through PDE4 inhibitors, which are also anti-inflammatory in the lung, right? Like for
Mhm.
instance, Abelard, which is a very powerful PDE4 inhibitor, which has been on the market in Japan for a long time, is used to treat asthma. Um, and now it's actually in, I think there's a drug company putting it through clinical trials for like ALS and a couple other things. But anyway, so I say like, okay, so let's take this concept, that's the molecular biology concept in Western medicine, and let's look at, research into traditional medicines and how those work at the molecular biological level, and then try and use that to to take advantage of this research of, about the molecular biological effects of these um, these particular systems, and then look for synergies. Instead of just looking at one particular pathway reaction, you look at the whole pathway
Mhm.
and see if there's a way to take these weaker natural effects and synergistically combine them to have a stronger, more significant effect. And then you have to figure out if it works or not. And so that's just subjective. I mean, that's self-experimentation, which is, it's better. It's better than 10 years, of clinical trials. So,
Mhm.
um, that's where the kind of bro science and, hey guys, try this out, tell me what you think. That's where that comes in.
Gotcha.
And the point about that is being open to criticism, and any, just taking any kind of negativity and just, but like looking at that very seriously, and saying like, well, what are these, does this person have a point? And then, taking and replying to that and researching it and using it as a way to go in a different direction. And there were some early um, developments in CILTEP, for instance, like people were using quercetin instead of luteolin for a long time. And quercetin didn't really work that well. I mean, it was a strong effect, but it was sort of aggravating and like a little anxiety producing and a little unsettling. And
Mhm.
and there was, like, for instance, Zembrin, which is which comes from uh, which is actually, that's a name brand for Canas, which is a South African herb. That's a strong PDE4 inhibitor, but that one makes me really irritable. Like I can't have a good conversation
Mhm.
with somebody without, I can't make a connection. But it's great for sitting at home and just studying and not talking to anybody. Um, and then there's other things I found which I don't really think are worth um, giving out to the general public, because it's like kind of a way to get into a weird psychological state, or even a little, you know too happy or whatever. But I just don't think it's sustainable, and it's just it's the kind of thing I don't think people would benefit from in the long term. So
Mhm.
there's definitely a lot of like wrong turns, and well, that wasn't so great, or that didn't really work, or um and that's that's how these things are developed. And that's because everybody else in the market, they look at single ingredient studies,
Hmm.
they have like tons of research, and then they put all those single ingredients together, and that's why everybody has the exact same product.
Hmm.
And the
Gotcha.
way I do things is I think, well, okay, let's examine the whole pathway, the whole pathway where tryptophan gets turned into serotonin, and what are all the steps along the pathway, and what are
Hmm.
the cofactors, and what are the, like for instance, how does tryptophan, when there's a high level of cortisol, how does it get turned into kynurenic acid instead of getting turned into 5-HT and then it's serotonin? Well, well, how do we lower cortisol with rhodiola? So that will keep it from being diverted into that pathway. And uh, so I look at these things as sort of a functional medicine systems biology approach. And there are actually a couple, there's a couple of companies that are natural supplement companies that are starting to do that with like anti-aging stuff mainly. But I think that, university studies, they don't really study multiple ingredients together. It's usually just one ingredient. And so that's kind of how you get that's sort of why everything's stagnated, is you have all these ingredients and then people are thinking about them individually. And that's a little, I don't think that's the most powerful technique.
Hmm. Gotcha. So you're more interested in sort of like a complex upregulation instead of just a narrow attack. And it seems like the narrower sort of like single molecule approaches seem to have more like negative externalities. Do you think that's fair?
Well, not all of them. I just think that they're not as effective as they could be, because you just don't for instance, if you take a lot of tryptophan and you have high levels of cortisol, you'll get kynurenic acid, which is anxiety producing. So you have to, lower, keep the cortisol under control in order to make sure that that tryptophan is more likely to get turned into serotonin. So it's like, there's a lot of things where you get mixed results, or um, that just could be better if things were, if people were thinking more in systems. Or you have something like, say like amphetamines, which is activates this receptor called TAR1, which causes dopamine to be dumped into the synaptic cleft. And then that doesn't, and dopamine it's not the pleasure molecule, it's the
Hmm.
compulsion molecule. So whatever you're doing, you just feel compelled to do it. It's not, there's no real rhyme or reason. While Ciltep, it makes your dopamine do more, but it doesn't increase it it doesn't cause it to get dumped into the synaptic cleft just willy-nilly. So these things are, these systems are complicated, and instead of thinking about the system, they just think about like chemical in, like whatever metric out, instead of thinking like, how is this affecting the system, what's going on around it, um, what are the long-term effect, what might be the long-term effects, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So when we were talking about coffee, you mentioned that you take, a bunch of supplements in the morning, and this makes me think of kind of these like I like to think of it as like nootropics list of pill swag. And so like, obviously like Ray Kurzweil comes to mind with his like, I take 100 pills a day. Um, and maybe those lists are sometimes a little bit over the top, but like sometimes like, what's the limit? Like what's too many supplements to take?
Oh, too many supplements to take.
I think we both
Well,
probably are less bothered by long lists, but
yeah. Well, I tend to change it up a little bit depending on what I have to do that day
mhm.
and what kind of mood I'm in, how my brain chemistry is working. For instance, if I'm going to be doing like a lot of writing, like fun fact, I'm currently in law school.
Oh wow, cool.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. That's it's a lot of work, especially since most people in there are 20 years younger than me. Uh, but, um, so if but if I'm gonna have to write some really long brief or something, um, or I'm doing programming, if I'm going to spend the whole day programming, then it's one stack. But if I'm just going to go on like a nature hike or hang out with friends or socialize, it's another stack. And then there's all the longevity stuff, and you you can take that every day, or not. I mean, longevity is interesting because there's a lot of different approaches, and it's sort of, the metrics are kind of hard to measure. I mean, unless you can get these telomere length tests, and
Mhm.
they're not cheap. So yeah, that's the thing about longevity stuff, is there a lot of different ideas, a lot of different stuff to take, but the feedback on it isn't so fast, and it's a lot of pills. So
For
so
sure.
I I tend, I mean, so I tend to take, just the basic, like, immune system supports stuff, and basic vitamins, and then the cognitive stack is on top of that, depending on what kind of activity I'm doing that day.
Gotcha. Um, cool. So, when you're like testing these supplements and stuff, I know that you use like these sort of brain tests to just like verify that it's actually working, and because I think some drugs and some supplements can make you maybe feel like you're more productive, but you aren't actually more productive. What's in your arsenal of tools for like actually testing how well they work?
Yeah, well, I have a app that I built for the Braverman test that just tells me, like, what my scores are. And then I also use Cambridge Brain Sciences, and they used to, now you have to like log in and sign up for a bunch of stuff, and but before, they used to have these flash games, and you know I use those. I use those pretty extensively. Like, I played them hundreds of times, so I got a
Mhm.
really good baseline. So I knew where where I was at, and then when things um, what things worked and what things didn't, or made cognition worse. And that was great, because since I had played these games hundreds of times, I knew exactly where I was at,
Mhm.
and anything that moved the needle uh, was significant. So,
What would you say like the biggest jump that you made the needle go is?
uh, well, there are some pretty strong stacks that are a little overstimulating, that I don't like to take that often.
Mhm.
Um, but that I mean, they can make the stacks. I mean, make the needle move pretty far. Like, if I take like Zembrin, and there's and Abutilast, and then Forskolin, and all the other base Siltep stuff. I mean, that can get pretty. Um, I can get pretty high scores at some of the memory tests and planning tests. Um, those are the and then there's other things. There's more subjective things, like with paracetam. It's um it's easier to if you look at a table with a whole bunch of objects on it. When I take paracetam, I can quickly kind of pick out all the different objects very um, very efficiently.
Mhm.
And then there's other things, like with paracetam and rhodiola together, I start to get all these old memories coming up, and just remembering things that happened in like high school or 20 years ago, and just randomly flooding in. Sometimes I'll sit down and I'll just write a diary entry, and just write out all these different things that happened over the years, that I just
Mhm.
randomly remember. Um, there's another stack with I can't really say the ingredient right now, because this might be part of a patent application, but it makes it so that I for a very short period of time, I almost record like what's going on around me, and then I can recall it, like, so I remember things that happened, like, about 2 hours worth of time that happened a couple of years ago. very vividly, and it wasn't that important. It wasn't like a dramatic thing in my life or anything like that. It was just like the record button on my brain got turned on, and I don't know if this stuff is if it'll work out. It's it, it's kind of um, a strange one.
Yeah, I've seen some like sort of bunk nootropics posts out there about like, oh, this is the eidetic memory stack, and um, I believe you a little bit more than I believe some of these posts, but yeah, I mean that sounds very interesting.
I think that there's this problem where things that work really, really well kind of feel a little recreational excessively, and I don't know if I can sell that. I just
Yeah.
or
Mhm.
I want some the products I make. I want people to be able to take every day and not have to worry about it.
Mhm.
And so if you make something like this really, really strong and powerful and like, oh wow, and but kind of almost recreational, it just sort of it goes against that goal.
Gotcha. So when you're experimenting with these like sort of like the non-natural stacks version of Siltap and like these stronger stacks, are you doing like a pill press type thing yourself, or what does the preparation of this look like?
Oh,
Or are you just buying pills?
yeah, I just take them all separately.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can make your own pills and stuff, but that's that's more trouble than it's worth. I mean, I have a milligram scale and I measure out the exact dosages and that kind of thing when I'm working with bulk ingredients, for example. But and that's basically the limitation of that.
Gotcha. Cool. Are there any other sort of like, I guess, like more modern nootropic strategies that you're interested in? Like not necessarily pharmacological, but like, for instance, like TDCS or something like that.
Um, well, I think that meditation is great.
Hmm.
Like I have two devices that I use from time to time. I have a Muse, which is basically this consumer grade EEG that tells you how well you're meditating
Nice.
by playing these background noises like a shore, and it's either stormy or it's quiet depending on what your brain's doing. I'm a big fan of that one, and also I have a brain tap, which is um, which has both binaural beats, isochronic tones, LEDs in the ears, and then it has flashing lights in front of the eyes for brainwave entrainment to um, get your brain quickly into various states, for instance, alpha wave states or beta wave states. And there's a whole bunch of programs with it for achieving different goals. And it's I listen to mostly like the music programs for relaxing or starting the day, and that's sort of it's kind of like meditation done for you, because the flashing lights sort of quickly put your the brain into various states. So
Hmm.
I think that's pretty powerful technique. I mean, one thing that I think is under leveraged is mitochondrial enhancement.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I made a stack for Axon Labs called Mitogen, um, which has a bunch of different somewhat obscure supplements.
It's like
uh,
the idebenone and all that.
yeah, debonine, sulbutamine, arlipoic acid, and a few others, and that combined with like methylene blue is incredible for like athletic endurance. Um, Methylene blue is a weird one. It's I mean, I can do far more athletically when I take methylene blue than otherwise. and it really increases the efficiency of mitochondria. I mean, it's mainly used, I believe, um, for carbon monoxide poisoning, and and just basically insults to the metabolic system of the mitochondria. But and it was used for malaria treatment for a long time. It's been around for like 100 years. There's a lot of old drugs that are people have found interesting uses for over time, and I just think and people are still researching these drugs, for various conditions and so forth. And then let's see, is there anything else? I do a lot of self-monitoring. I have an Oura ring that I wear for sleep monitoring. Yeah, do you use that one? Oh yeah, you have one.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and then there's haven't found. I'd like to get more into pulse oximetry.
I don't know anything about
I
that.
mean, just to or blood oximetry, just to make sure that I'm sleeping well. I'm not like having any sort of issues with low blood oxygen levels when I'm sleeping, that sort of thing. How about you?
Oh, I mean, I just have the sort of basic stacks, and I mean, I do like HRV training, sort of in that gamified way, like with the Muse that you mentioned. But I use an M Wave, and I'm trying to think of what other weird things I have. I actually have a bottle of methylene blue sitting in my kitchen that I haven't touched in months, and you're making me think that I should go back and try it. Is there any sort of guideline that you have for anybody trying to like acquire methylene blue to make sure that it is the right grade?
Yeah, you want USP pharmaceutical grade. Anything less than that, I wouldn't take.
Gotcha.
So that which is kind of difficult to come by. That's one of the issues with it, and the dosing, and then it stains everything bright blue. If you like drip it somewhere, it's gonna permanently stain whatever it is blue.
But
I was
peeing blue is just so fun.
Yeah, I was talking to I was at RAADfest, which is the Revolution Against Aging and Death festival last year, and I was talking to a doctor who prescribes this for his patients for Alzheimer's, and he was saying, "Oh yeah," he tells them like before you do this, get ready to like have your whole bathroom be completely stained blue. Just get a blue rug, get blue everything, because it's all going to be blue.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's I think it's interesting though that yeah, RAADfest is really great, because that's where a lot of people with a lot of resources who really want to live forever, they go there, and they have a lot of interesting things like exosomes, which are these um, packets of growth factors.
Hmm.
There's then there's people who are doing genetic modification of their adult cells, like BioViva. This gal Liz Parrish, she
Yeah.
genetically modified herself to have longer telomeres and inhibit myostatin, increasing her muscle development. Oh, one thing that I did pick up there that I really like a lot is infrared light panels,
Oh, cool.
660 nanometers. Uh, I've had some back problems over the years, and that really helps clear them up. Um, it's a great system for just general healing, in my opinion, from what I've seen. So, and I do that like 6 minutes front and back. Uh, and also, one interesting thing that a piece of science that I was exploring. I mean, I don't know if this is valid or not. Is they were doing this inactivation of viruses with methylene blue and visible light, and and methylene blue absorbs light much better at certain wavelengths, like I think around 660, 680 nanometers. So there was some speculation that, you could combine these red light panels or intranasal red light with methylene blue and sort of generate this uh, singlet oxygen species to kill viruses or something like that. But that was just some speculation. I mean, that's a thread I have on longevity that I'm kind of I'm posting a bunch of studies too, and there's some other people commenting. I mean, that's kind of how I like to do things. I like to think about, I get some idea, and then I say, get on longevity, and I sort of say, here's my theory, what do you guys think? And then just wait for some criticism, or and then I self-experiment myself and kind of post anything that I find one way or another. And usually I attract a bunch of haters, and but then I attract some people who are supportive of it, and just kind of through the back and forth, we kind of figure out if the idea develops in one way or another. And not everything works, and with Siltep being the most successful example of that.
Gotcha. So you were talking earlier about like the supplements that you would take for longevity, and you said that there are a bunch of different approaches. What sort of approaches are you thinking?
Well, okay, one of the first approaches is telomeres, or lengthening telomeres.
Okay.
And so there's expensive supplements, which are and they're all variously purified versions of cycloestrogenol from astragalus.
Okay.
And there was a guy on, but then to tell how long your telomeres are is you have to do, like, I think there's like a test called lifelink or something like that. I mean, I did telo years, and it said I was 10 years younger than my actual age. People have various things that they say about these different tests, and some of them are more expensive than others, and so I just kind of have to go with, like, well, what people say on longevity, that, like, okay, I took this generic brand, this like some brand of astragalus, and I tested my telomeres, and like 6 months later they were a little longer. Like, okay, sure. But I mean, if you look at like the super centenarians, like the people who live to like past 110, there was this woman who lived to 115, I think it was in the Netherlands, and she donated her body to science, and they found that there were 2 stem cells left in her body that were producing white blood cells. And so the thinking is that you can. And then there was the lady who invented NGF, and she was doing medical research up until she died at 103. So she was really bright all the way up until she dropped dead. So what that thinking goes to is that when your immune system is exhausted, that is what determines lifespan. Failing that, you die some other way. That is the gating factor. So basically, making these stem cells that produce immune system cells last longer is key to lifespan, not health span, which you know the difference between the concepts.
Right. Yeah.
So that would be lengthening telomeres, or regenerating the thymus, which is this little organ you have right here that is crucial to the immune system functioning. And and then there's this really interesting approach. Well, there's the lengthening telomeres approach, right? Then there's the epigenetic theory of aging. And the epigenetic theory of aging says that aging is just another programmed stage of life, like puberty. Okay, so you're born, you've got you're a kid, then you go through puberty, then you're adolescent, then you are an adult, and then your body says, okay, now we're just gonna start slowly winding stuff down. And so the idea with these things called Russian peptides,
Mm,
which are actually natural products. So you can get they're pretty widely available, but they were developed in Russia, and this I mean I think this is the story. They were developed because they were trying to the Russian military was trying to figure out how to regenerate organs that were damaged in warfare. And so what they did was they took uh, livestock, like young livestock, and they would take their particular organs and they would extract all the low molecular weight peptides out of them and concentrate them, and then they would put them in these pills. And the idea was that these low molecular weight peptides could epigenetically activate a younger phenotype and allow the organ to regenerate.
mm,
Um, so this is the idea behind these Russian peptides. Now, um, it's something that's it almost sounds too good to be true, but some of the most extreme anti-aging biohackers I know who look really good for their age, being in their 70s, they swear by these. So it seems like, yeah, maybe that could work. So uh, that's um, that's something that I think is interesting. And then you have the SENS approach, which is Aubrey de Grey.
mm,
You got these 7 forms of damage that are caused by aging. And so um, his idea is that if you if you just get rid of these forms of damage, then you won't age. Um, so uh, the main forms of damage that are sort of hard to, I mean, well, telomere shortening is one of them. Uh, then there's here, I'll just pull up the page here. um, there's there's cancer. There's advanced glycation end products. There's advanced glycation end products is interesting. That's why people who are raw vegans look pretty good as they age. It's basically if you when you have these basically when you brown when you cook stuff, it gets brown. When you barbecue stuff, it gets black. And uh, in those foods are high levels of advanced glycation end products, and these um, cause proteins to stick together, and they're what scientific studies say cause wrinkly skin and hardening of the arteries and all sorts of other tissue damage from aging. And so if you eat a low glycation a diet low in these things like raw foods, that slows the accumulation of these. And they actually did this study and they found out that the least amount of advanced glycation end products were created by microwaving food, which was
huh,
really counterintuitive because, you know, uh, people who are into health usually don't recommend microwaving things. So, but, and also, the worst thing you could, for advanced glycation end products is certain food additives like caramel color or like burnt like meat or something.
gotcha.
So, and yeah, so I mean the idea there is oh, and then there's the NAD stuff. Oh, I did NAD injections and those were great.
Huh,
uh yeah, so this is uh that's a it's like a mitochondrial enhancement. Basically, like NAD, the level of our NAD in our cells falls as we age, and it's used for like DNA repair and all sorts of cellular repair. And you can get IVs of this stuff. And I mean, I just did some injections, like with insulin needles, and uh, yeah, that made me feel very energetic, and it lasted for about 2 weeks. So I mean, they have NAD booster supplements and so forth, and there's controversy about how bioavailable all this stuff is, like
Mhm.
and how well it works. But
I mean, David Sinclair does look fucking excellent for his age. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, right. It's amazing when you go to like these longevity conventions, how well some of these people look. Like this one guy I know who does who does regular extended fasting. That's another
mhm,
thing is um, I try and do a 3-day fast a couple times a year because after you get past 48 hours, autophagy kicks in, and
mhm.
that's where the body cleans out, cellular junk and kills senescent cells, which are malfunctioning, which are cells that have something's happened to them, maybe DNA damage or something like that, and they're just malfunctioning and sending out inflammatory signals to the other cells and just sort of screwing up the rest of the organs that they're in. And so by starving yourself, the body is looking around for sources of energy once it runs out of the very short-term sources, and so it engages these systems which do a lot of cleanup. And this used to be a normal part of human biology back when food wasn't as common as it is now. So that's and people I see at longevity conventions who look really good are regular. Some of them are regular fasters.
Gotcha. Very cool. I think a while back you mentioned a broccoli soup that you were making that was like that you were coming up with a recipe that was specifically just trying to like bump up the sulforaphane. Have you been consuming that still, or can you tell me
Yeah,
about that recipe?
I mean, sulforaphane is in my longevity stack along with astragalus, um, and I take that on a fairly regular basis. And it's a basically the idea behind sulforaphane is it's this cellular stress pathway, and there's like a hormetic effect, which means that the body sort of responds to the cellular stress and starts um, doing some cleanup. I mean, that's there are people who have much deeper knowledge of that than I do. But you know, the thing about anti-aging is it's harder to self-experiment with that because you don't
Hmm.
really get a lot of rapid feedback unless you do really expensive tests. So um, yeah, so that's sort of I mean, I'm still interested in that, but it's all kind of theoretical, and I like to be practical. I like to
Hmm.
see what the effects are right away, and with all the cognitive stuff, that's really easy. Um, because if I'm sitting down, I'm gonna write a whole bunch of code, or I'm gonna write like a 3,000 word like legal brief. I know if things are working or not. If I'm running all these Cambridge brain science tests that I've backed up over the years. Um, it's just a different kind of thing altogether. I mean, yeah, anti-aging is. I guess you could look at athletic performance, but there are things that are, mitochondrial enhancement is great for short-term athletic performance. The mitogen and methylene blue and those kinds of strategies. So, yeah, I mean, that's really the barrier to like doing more anti-aging research is you can't really easily tell what's working,
Hmm.
and you need these like very long-term studies to with lots of very sensitive cellular level tests to kind of figure that out.
Cool. So in the remaining few minutes, I wanted to talk a bit about transhumanism, but I want to close the conversation on life extension a little bit by just asking basically when is too early to start thinking about anti-aging? Because I got into transhumanism and I feel like everybody in that field's a little bit older, and there's no real reason for me at 31 to really be caring about anti-aging yet, is there?
Well, I think that if you believe that aging is progressive damage, and the only way to interfere with that is to, or stop that damage as soon as possible. Then you might want to start thinking about that. I mean, just as maybe taking some astragalus, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's just when people get to be older and they, things start going wrong, they start to think about that kind of stuff a lot more
Hmm.
um, than they otherwise would. So it's more readily apparent that they should be working on that. But it doesn't hurt to start early. Especially if you're, just taking various herbal approaches and stuff, and
Hmm.
that's prudent.
Gotcha. I'm getting an early start, I guess, but a lot of people are just like, you don't need to be thinking about that. But anyway, with the remaining few minutes, let's talk about transhumanism. And I feel like for somebody that's into transhumanism, you aren't going around like waving the flag like some other people would. So I feel like that's a more interesting perspective on the movement. And I'm curious, from your vantage point, what you sort of feel like the current movement is like, and where you'd like to see it go.
I I think that I am not a fan of brain uploading,
Okay.
because if you could simulate what's going on at a fine grain level in the brain, you could develop drugs inside of a computer. But you can't, because things like protein folding, which is where your cells make proteins and then they fold up, and the way they fold up makes them do all these very complex things inside the cell. That is a algorithm that is very difficult to do inside of a computer. You could have biggest computer you want, and it's not going to be able to do that because it's exponential time complexity, which is, computer scientists' way of saying it takes a really long time,
Hmm.
like more than the age of the universe for some problems. Um, and so I think that whole like computer simulation of people and brain uploading is just like, let's see if we can make a program that can fool your friends into believing it's you.
Mm.
And so that whole part of it is just sort of, um, I'm just not a fan of, and I think it sort of makes me get a bad impression of the rest of it, and I'd rather just focus on um, the biological aspects of it,
Mhm.
uh, as opposed to the integrating with computers. I mean, I think the first cool thing that I've actually seen that might get somewhere is the brain implant stuff that Elon Musk is doing.
Mhm.
I watched the video for that, and I like that has input, it has output, so it can read brain signals, but it can also input brain signals. Uh, so you can have some sort of direct conversation with a computer interface. Now, that's the first thing I've seen from those, like, those sort of that sort of angle that's really credible. And there's people who are into like freezing themselves after they die, and then thinking nanobots will revive them, but that just seems so far out there. One thing I do think, though, is adult genetic modification will really change humanity. Maybe it's 50 years off, um,
Mhm.
but imagine, you could have any color eyes you want, any color hair you want, any color skin you want. um, you want to be smarter, you want to bigger lips. I mean, it's basically like plastic surgery at the genetic level, where you can do all sorts of weird strange stuff. I mean, I imagine that, like, in the future, you'll have like the Android and the iOS platform for like genetic modifications, and you'll just install these things like they're apps. Like, you want your liver to work a little better, that's like an app. Or you know, you want
Mhm.
your organs to like process. You want to be a fast caffeine metabolizer instead of a slow caffeine metabolizer. Well, that's an app. So, and that'll just really kind of play with the idea of what it is, of like what identity is, because people will be able to change their genetic structure by their how they choose, as they when they're older. And so it'll be like, well, I want to be this, or I want to have this genetic feature, that genetic feature. um, and maybe we'll find ways to, I mean, they in mice, they have these experiments where they, you know, significantly increase the intelligence of mice by modifying their genetics. And so maybe we'll have that for like adults, because basically the way they do it is they have these viruses that kind of, you know, invade the cells and then like replace some genes. Um, so it's as if the person was born with those, and it's weird because not all the cells get the genetic modification. So you have two different sets of genes in your body. So yeah, but I think that's going to be that's sort of the future that's already here but not evenly distributed, because you know to do those genetic modifications costs like $1 million, and not very many people have done those. So it's, you know, but I think it'll probably come down in price over time. But you know, it's kind of a Pandora's box, you know, making being able to gene edit ourselves and being able to gene edit other species, and you know, who knows where that could lead. It's such a powerful technology.
Do you follow David Pierce at all?
No.
Interesting. David Pierce is like very much my brand of transhumanism, and he's interesting because he's like a lifelong vegan, and his whole thing is sort of like reducing suffering, and you know, he feels like it's our you know, it's our duty to basically genetically try to engineer out suffering and things like this. And that's interesting that I feel like he's one of the people that coined the term transhumanism. So curious that you don't know him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, engineering out suffering. Well, you know, it's funny because, you know, you look at these neurotransmitters and think, well, everybody should have pleasure all the time. And then the pleasure receptor is like the opioid receptor. And like, we know how that all goes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's, so the brain is kind of evolutionarily built up in its way to kind of, you know, in a Darwinistic way to kind of tell you to do things that ensure your survival in this earth we live in here. And you know, it's sprinkled all these opioid receptors around the brain. And for instance, there's some in like the vision processing centers that make us think that certain things are beautiful. You know, if you act like we have built-in recognition of secondary sexual characteristics, you know, that every male on Earth will, you know, adult male on Earth will understand for the most part. I mean, there's all these things that are kind of built into the wiring, and you know, that incentivize us or like give us pleasure, or um, you know, or we don't like bitter tastes, for example. And you know, just messing with that wiring, I mean, that's our survival program, you know. And you have to um, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, you know. Like there's this I don't know if you've ever there's this kappa opioid receptor, and it's the opposite of the mu opioid receptor in that when it's activated, it causes depression.
Okay.
And some people were thinking that, like, well, maybe if you repetitively activated this receptor, you'd build up tolerance to it. It would build up tolerance, and that would be harder to get depressed. So
Interesting.
yeah,
Good approach.
right. So I mean, that's how people think that like salvia divinorum has like a antidepressant effect. Don't take that. It's not a good drug. You know, even though you can get it, it's legal. I think it's partially legal in some states. You know, I don't know. Yeah, but it's just you know, we got all these little programs in our brain that tell us to do stuff, you know, or make us enjoy things, and you know, I don't know if I agree with that approach that we just have to eliminate all those negative feedback things, you know, so it's just positive feedback. It's a deep question. It's very philosophical.
Well, cool. Well, on that note, we're at over an hour, so I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
Uh, no, just if you want to keep up with me, my Twitter is at Siltep, Ciltep, and my website is abelardresearch.com, where I write articles from time to time about various biohacking, transhumanism, longevity stuff I'm thinking about.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining me. It was really cool talking to you.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, and it's fun to explore all those ideas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks. I'll talk to you later.
All right.